So today's session is titled Using New Tools, Measuring Consumer Opinions with Biometrics. And I won't name names, but a few Summit or a few Animal Ag Alliance staffers have said, to be honest with you, I have no idea what we're going to hear during this panel. So I'm curious of where you're at as an attendee. How would you rate your current understanding of measuring consumer opinions with biometrics? All right, so nobody totally understands it. Most people have maybe heard of it. They've heard of it, but they don't really get it, or they've never heard of it. So hopefully after today, you will be a little bit more well-versed in this subject after hearing from our expert speakers. Those panelists are Tyler Davis, an associate professor of psychological sciences at Texas Tech, Rhonda Miller, a professor of meat science at Texas A&M, and Jessica Meisinger, the North American Sustainability Lead at Merck Animal Health. Tyler, you can go ahead and share your screen and get ready. If you're interested in full bios for our speakers, you can find those on the Virtual Summit website. So again, check the chat box for a link to the full speaker bios on the Virtual Summit website. With that, I will turn things over to Tyler. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm excited to be here at the Animal Ag Alliance for the first time. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about some research that I've been doing with Merck Animal Health and some other partners at Texas Tech, looking at how we can use functional neuroimaging to understand consumer perceptions of food technologies. So before we get started on that, as the poll showed, many of you at least don't feel like you totally understand biometrics for looking at consumer impressions. So I'm going to go through a little bit about what functional neuroimaging is at a very basic level. So the type of functional neuroimaging that I'm going to be talking to you about today is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, and it measures changes in blood oxygen levels as the brain is working to process something. Your brain's working all the time whenever you're doing stuff, but whenever you're doing something new or something in particular, we can measure changes in how a certain brain region is processing information associated with something you're looking at. So we can take something like this infographic down here about animal welfare and look at what parts of the brain are active when people are processing this information. This can give us an idea of not only where in the brain and what areas are active while people are processing information about this infographic, but they can also tell us what information they're processing, how they're processing it, how they're thinking about this information. And we can do this in close to real time. So current fMRI allows us to measure things at a 1 to 2 second resolution. So we can get fairly fine-grained temporal resolution on how you're processing this information and how that's changing as you read through an infographic. So why would you want to do this in the first place? So obviously, everything that we do, think of behavior, all of that stuff is generated by the brain. And looking at the brain potentially gives us an idea of the many different dimensions with which we can process information about foods and technologies. So whenever you give people information about perhaps new animal welfare techniques or something you're doing in terms of sustainability, people activate a lot of different attitudes and ideas about those things. So they think of, more how that associates with, their morals or their beliefs or values. And you can get an idea then based on looking at the brain, because different information processing dimensions are associated with different patterns of brain activation. You can get an idea of which of these things are being activated while people are looking at your infographics or information about the welfare and sustainability practices that you're doing. And by harnessing these different dimensions and according to the brain activation, we can potentially get better leverage on outcomes. So how might consumers change their minds about this particular practice on the basis of reading this information? We're going to see today some examples of how the brain activation could actually predict people's attitude changes based on looking at infographics. We've used fMRI in my research and in partnership with others at Texas Tech for a number of different consumer topics. So the brain activation you see on the slide here is from a study where we looked at different qualities of beef. We fed consumers really high quality strip loin versus a lower quality strip loin. And we could see that after they ate the high quality, which was a prime strip loin, we got a lot more activation in the reward centers of the brain. These are centers of the brain that are associated with feeling good, liking something. We can use this to measure other aspects of food preferences, also look at how people are making decisions, and then what we'll be talking about today, which is to look at consumer attitudes. Key brain regions for consumer decision-making and attitudes, there's a number of them in the brain, but the ones we're going to be talking about today are in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is towards the front of your brain, and it's the outer neocortical layer, that kind of wrinkly layer that you often see depicted in pictures. Even though we talk about the prefrontal cortex oftentimes as the seat of reason, or where people are, doing a lot of their online thinking about things, different parts of the prefrontal cortex do different things, and they tend to be associated with different aspects of attitudes. Some parts of the prefrontal cortex are kind of more cognitive. Some of them can be more emotional or affective. The lateral prefrontal cortex, lateral is meaning the sides here, tends to activate when people are more uncertain or sense more risk with things. This is a very cognitive part of the brain that's involved in kind of resolving uncertainty or thinking harder about things. Generally, when people are thinking harder about things or are more uncertain, that leads them to not like things quite as much. But sometimes, obviously, we hope that thinking hard about things can lead people to also change their minds about things. The medial prefrontal cortex isn't the opposite from the lateral, but it tends to be associated with much more positive and automatic valuation processes. So when you see the medial prefrontal cortex activated, that's oftentimes for things that people tend to like more or assign a greater positive value for. So this tends to be more of a feeling good or liking thing kind of brain region. It also tends to activate more confident people are in the decisions that they're making. So we're going to look at these two brain regions relative to consumer perceptions of food technologies. We know that consumer perceptions are highly influenced by social and visual media. Oftentimes, consumers don't have a great idea of how these technologies work. They get their attitudes and their beliefs about them largely from interacting with other people, from print and social media, and so on. And the industry has been using infographics, to capitalize on this for a long time and somewhat get out better information to combat the misinformation that you hear about food technologies. So infographics have become a central means for conveying benefits and risks associated with food and agricultural technologies. And here we're going to look at whether functional neuroimaging can be used to predict attitudes and attitude change for food technologies. This is the way our overall study looks. The main goal is to show people infographics, which is in the middle here. We show people the same infographics in a number of cycles of 30 seconds. We give people an idea before they see this of what information they should be looking for. Here we tell them to focus on information about risks. And then we ask them a number of survey questions afterwards so that we get good behavioral measures of those constructs we're looking at. I'm going to go through each of the infographics that we looked at really quickly. Many of you have probably seen these before. They're available on Merck Animal Health's website. The first one is animal welfare, which talks a lot about moderate advances in animal welfare, talking about climate control systems, the importance of shelter and veterinary care. There's vaccines, which talks about benefits to animals, people, and the environment. There's antibiotics, which uses a number of different strategies to try to get people to reason better about vaccine resistance and how it's being used in agriculture, especially talking about how different antibiotics are used in humans and animals for the most part, and the amount of antibiotics used for people and animals is proportional to the overall number of humans and animals out there. The hormone implants one is very interesting as well. It looks primarily at people's dose to response and sensitivity. So people tend to, when they're reasoning about chemicals, say if they don't like a chemical at all, even a small amount of that's bad for them. This infographic tries to get at that a little bit by showing you that a lot of dietary sources of estrogen, for example, are a lot higher than what you would get from beef where hormone implants were used. GMOs gets at some of the environmental and climate and sustainability aspects of GMOs. And then there's a general sustainability infographic as well. So we show people these while they're inside an MRI scanner. If you've never been in an MRI scanner before, they're kind of a big noisy tube. They look a lot like a CAT scan. And when they're inside it, the main difference between what we're doing and what you would have experienced if you were in one of these before is we're projecting these infographics and questions to people while they're inside the scanner using a projection screen. And then they can answer and communicate with us using buttons or a microphone that's inside the scanner. Before we go over the MRI results for the infographics, I'll talk quickly about just the behavioral ratings. In general, after reading the infographics, people tended to find antibiotics and hormones as more risky than some of the other topics. And the brain activation patterns in lateral prefrontal cortex tended to track those feelings of risk. So as I was saying, this brain region tends to be active more the more we're thinking hard about things, the more we're uncertain about them, and thus it tends to track people's perceptions or feelings of risk, which are really associated with our innate uncertainty response. So more risky means more activation in this brain region. So we saw more activation for antibiotics and hormones and less activation for the less perceived risk topics like sustainability and vaccines. Interestingly, we could actually predict for hormones in particular how much people were going to change their attitudes based on activation in this brain region. So if you look at the scatter plot here, it's actually mostly centered below 0, which means that their post-risk, what they rated the risks of hormones as after they saw the infographics, tends to be lower than their pre-risk. So the infographic here is working to some extent, but the more people are turning on this brain region, the more they're resisting that change in risk perception. So turning on this brain region associated with uncertainty and kind of thinking hard about this here is leading people to actually resist changing their risk perception in this case. Positive attitudes largely mirror the perceptions of risk for these infographics. So animal welfare, sustainability, and GMOs tended to rate more positively according to positive attitudes. And now we see a different brain region coming online, the medial prefrontal cortex, that tends to track those positive attitudes towards the infographics. So more positive in this case would be animal welfare. And again, people are less positive towards the antibiotics and hormones. So when this brain region turns on, it tells us more about what infographics and topics people are liking as they're reading these things. We're also able, using a different brain region, to predict changes in positive attitudes. This one is specifically for the GMO infographic. So here we see the supramarginal gyrus. It's another part of the brain that I didn't talk about yet, but it's part of the parietal cortex, which is towards the back of your brain and on the upper sides of it. And this brain region, specifically in terms of attitudes and social psychology constructs, tends to track mentalizing kind of theory of mind things where you're trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes and doing some moral reasoning about things. And if you take a look at the GMO infographic in this case, there actually were a lot of moral arguments in that, talking about the benefits of GMOs for climate, benefits of GMOs for sustainability. So it makes some sense here why we're seeing, if people's attitudes are improving in this case, they're activating that kind of more moral reasoning center. So in conclusion, functional neuroimaging allows us to predict consumer responses to food technology information. The lateral prefrontal cortex tends to track, in this case, higher risk perception and less positive attitudes. And we saw resistance to change in risk perception for the hormone implants based on activation in this brain region. So we were able to predict for each person how much they would resist changing their attitudes about the hormones based on how much they were activating the lateral prefrontal cortex. The medial prefrontal cortex, that brain region that's associated with liking things and positive valuation, tended to instead track how much people liked the infographics and the technologies associated with them. So this was more active for animal welfare, sustainability, and those topics that people liked more. We're going in a number of different directions for this. So, beyond just looking at what people like or find more risky, there's a lot of things we can do in terms of how people are processing information about food and technologies. One of the things that we're looking into doing more is more real-time fMRI, and actually looking at how people's responses are changing as they look through an infographic or as they watch a video about these things. A lot of what we've done so far is just looking at the entire period when they're looking at infographics, but we know that people's attitudes might change on more of a second by second level if we get resolution to look at videos. Rhonda's going to be talking about eye movements after this, but we can also potentially map using eye movements where people are looking when they're having this more positive reaction to the infographics. So that's another thing that we're looking at doing more in the future. We're also going to be using brain data to get a wider multidimensional profile of how information is being processed. So I told you at the beginning, one of the reasons why you might be interested in MRI is that because it allows us to potentially map all of these different dimensions of how people are processing information onto concrete brain regions and then allow them to predict outcomes. So what we're going to be working with here is taking associations between brain regions and these different constructs like people's values, morals, norms, and how they're being activated by infographics, and then getting a profile for videos, infographics, or any kind of consumer information to look at how much that kind of activates those different constructs and which ones are being ultimately related to the outcomes associated with that infographic. So that's all for today, and I think I'm about out of time as well. I want to thank Dr. Miller and Jessica at Merck Animal Health, and also the grad students that worked on this. You can reach me on Twitter at Flatland Neuro, or contact me at my email address at TTU. If you want to read more about this specific project, it's currently available at Food Quality and Preference.
Hello, my name is Rhonda Miller, and I will be the next individual talking. And thank you very much, Tyler. I'm just trying to get my sharing on. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Appreciate your time and effort as you look at being an experiment here on a virtual presentation. But as Tyler said, I work with eye tracking and facial recognition for infographics. I have two colleagues, Dr. Marco Palma, who is actually the director of our Human Behavior Lab at Texas A&M University, and then the postdoctoral student, Hillary Martinez, who worked on this project. And what I want to talk to you today about is why am I, as a meat scientist, interested in a new consumer sensory tool? And we're going to talk about the same 6 infographics that Tyler talked about, but we're going to look at the heat maps, or where people looked. And I don't have the opportunity to look at their brains, but I want to be able to see if we can detect some of the emotions that are associated with each of those infographics, and if it relates to what Tyler saw with the information from the fMRI. And I think that you'll find that we actually had very similar responses, even though we had different consumers. And we were asking the question, did the infographics change consumers' perception? So I'm a meat scientist. I work with consumers. I'm really interested in understanding what are the drivers of consumers liking. And so when I think about sensory work, kind of more on the applied side, I have the job of providing a stimulus, say meat. Tyler did a good job of talking about the prime versus the select. And we know that when that individual takes in that meat, there's a stimulus, and the sense organs, if we're chewing, those are going to be the sight of that. It's going to be the flavor, the basic taste, the feeling factors in the mouth, the amount of force required to chew it. Lots of things are going on. And each of those sense organs have a sensation that they send that signal to the brain. The brain then processes that as perception, and then you get a response. So as a sensory person, what I do is I provide I evoke a response by feeding them steak. And then I ask them at the bottom of that previous slide to give me their response. And this is a picture of consumers that were doing a study where we're feeding them different meat samples. And we ask them then to rate their response on a score of 1 to 9 for overall liking, and for flavor liking and disliking. And that has been the traditional consumer research for the food industry. And we often talk about that as trying to understand overall drivers of liking. But there's a lot that goes on between the stimulus at the top up here and the response. And Tyler talked about that. Actually, that's a lot of his field. And so when we get that response as meat scientists, as sensory scientists, as people who are trying to understand that consumer, there's been a lot that's processed, and there might be other things that affect it. And Tyler did a really good job because that's his area of talking about all of those things. And I like this graphic here. I'm interested in consumer behavior, consumer response, and I work in the yellow area. The sensory factors, the visual appearance, the in-mouth texture, the flavor, the odor. We know all those factors go in and affect that consumer's sensory perception. But there are other factors that Tyler did such a good job of talking about that also influence that consumer behavior. So we're missing a lot of information as scientists when we think about what are drivers of liking, or what things do people like, or what are their perceptions. And at Texas A&M, we have some new tools. We have a human behavior lab. This is the one that Dr. Marco Palma, who I mentioned on the first slide, is the director of. And we have 5 basic tools. We have eye tracking, facial expression, EEG, which measures brain waves, ECG and EMG. I'm not even going to get into all those, but they measure the skin response and the heart rate and things like that, and galvanized skin response. Also, it tells us how people react. But in talking to Merck about their infographics, one of the things that we were interested in is using eye tracking and facial expressions to see if we could measure what consumers like and what they don't like, and what their emotions were. Now, let me tell you a little bit about eye tracking, because at first I'm going to tell you I didn't know what eye tracking was either. And here are 3 images that we gave people. Some of you that are in the beef industry will recognize we have a select and we have a small, and then we have a moderate amount of marbling. So these images look the same as far as color, but they just differed in marbling. And if we do eye tracking, so you're seeing those little yellow dots. Don't worry, I'm going to replay this. But what eye tracking does is it takes and it monitors where the eye is looking. And if you notice in this image, in this movie, people start on the left and they moved across the screen. And then we have what we call revisits. They went back and they looked again. So they're making some decisions. The size of the yellow circle indicates how long they spent. And so after knowing that, let me play this again. So you can see where they're looking, and then they come back. Oh, go back a couple times, come back, and they finish things up looking at that higher marbling. And it's obvious here they spent more time looking at the steak with the higher marbling, but they went back and forth a lot, didn't they? And so what we wanted to do with the infographics is that we wanted to see what people looked at, how much time they spent, and at what information they spent that time looking at, and then also use a combination of eye tracking and facial responses to measure their emotions. So let's look at the first infographic. And I'm going to use the antibiotic infographic first. And Tyler presented these to you. We used the same infographics in both different ways of measuring consumers. And you notice that there's information that's written, and then there's also images of individuals and animals. And we wanted to see, what did people look at? What did they spend the most time with? And then we also measured their emotions to see what they thought. Now, we also had questions before and after. I have a lot of data, but I'm not going to present it to you. If you're interested in this, you can always email me. But what I want you to think about is, okay, these are the heat maps. So a heat map is the darker red, the more time they spent. So this is the antibiotic graphic, and look where people spent most of their time. And just like Tyler gave them 30 seconds to look at the infographics when he was doing the fMRI, we also used 30 seconds to see where they spent their time. Now, it's obvious from this that they spent most of their time on that, the information right here about the antibiotic use in agriculture. And that's good, because that's some of the main information that we wanted them to have. They also spent quite a lot of time, not as much, down here in this circle. And they also, they also spent some time, with the 9.3 billion cows. Now, the information over on the right-hand side gives credibility for national associations. And did you notice that they did not receive that much time? People looked barely over there and then came back. So very interesting. What are they reading? What information were they getting from this? The table with the percentages, they only spent a little bit of time on. Now let's look at the animal welfare graphic. And this one, we know what the main goal here was: to provide information that people in animal agriculture are good stewards of their animals, and they want to take good care of them and provide them with good health. Let's look at where people looked. I thought this was interesting because in this infographic, they spent almost equal amount of time where there were the main written words. They really read this infographic. And if we go back, we see what that information is saying. So they at least read it, they spent time there, and hopefully thought about it. What about the GMOs? In the GMO graphic, of course, we're hoping that they understand from this that GMOs are safe. They did spend a lot of time on the top wording where it says GMOs are safe, and they spend an awful lot of time in the verbiage there that talks about for 20 plus years how we've used GMOs. And they did go to the bottom of the infographic and read about the advantages of GMOs within this information. The growth hormone infographic, there's a lot of verbiage on here. It would be interesting to think, what do you think that individuals, these are approximately 80 consumers that we measured, what did they look at? Think about that. Now let's look. They spent most of their time on the first wording about that animals that have been implanted with estrogenic compounds only have 1.9 nanograms, of estrogen, and where non-implanted meat is 1.3. Now, they did read a little bit about the other products, but they concentrated, and remember, they had 30 seconds. So in the previous infographic, they really looked at all the wording, and they kind of scanned this here. Notice they didn't even get down to the bottom, hardly at all, but they spent most of their time trying to understand the growth hormone concentration in meat. Sustainability, certainly a very important issue for our industry. Beautiful demographic, has lots of good information. Let's see where consumers looked. Compared to the last demographic, I thought it was interesting that for the sustainability infographic, notice that the heat map shows us that at the bottom, they really looked at the information that talked about the poultry industry. And they did read all of the written information. They spent a little bit more time in each of the boxes. Now, we have lots of data we collected from this. It talks about time of fixation. We know how they looked through this infographic, what they looked at first, what they moved to, what they moved back to. But what was interesting here is that they looked at all of this information. What about vaccines? Where did they look? What did they read? What information did they take in? Interestingly, they read the information, and I really thought people would kind of look at the cow here, the people, the pig, but people spent time reading this. Now, when they got down to the bottom about benefit to the environment, they didn't spend as much time, but they really looked at the benefit for animals and then spent most of their time on benefits for people. But they really did look at the infographic. So I said that not only did we have heat maps, but we also had, we used information because they were looking at a camera that did the eye tracking. They also looked at the information, and we got the algorithms to predict 7 core emotions. And this is just a kind of an overview of that. Those emotions are disgust, anger, sadness, contempt, joy, fear, and surprise. And what you want to do is look at what's clustered together. What was interesting is that the GMO infographic clustered with anger and disgust and sadness. Welfare was with joy. Vaccines was pretty neutral because it's in the center dot. Antibiotics and sustainability clustered more with fear. Very much similar type of information to what Tyler talked about. We also looked at these valence emotions. We looked at positive, negative, and neutral. And the animal welfare infographic was associated with positive thoughts. Negative thoughts, probably not surprising, GMO, antibiotics and vaccines a little bit, but mainly GMOs. From a neutral standpoint, sustainability and hormone use, they considered those to be neutral. So I hope this gives you a good idea of some of the tools that are coming out that really help us to understand our consumers and understand what they're thinking. And kind of the fun of all this is that combining what Tyler can do and what we can do and continuing to understand the consumer. I'll turn this over to Jessica now, and thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I am Jessica Meisinger, and I am going to be talking about why you should care about this research. It's always interesting to listen about new scientific achievements, but it always is more important to figure out how it applies to you and what you're currently working on. So, how you see and think influences how you buy and feel. I think most of us know that. Product differentiators can impact how you taste and how you feel about a product. There has been a ton of research decades ago about Coke and Pepsi, where people would be asked about their feelings in blind taste tests and then asked about them again when they knew which they were drinking, and they had different opinions. They've repeated those with the MRIs, and they've shown the same thing. So one part would light up of their brain when they didn't know what they were drinking, and another when they did. So it matters a lot for food, especially meat, because you have to buy the product taste untasted, if you will, a sort of food version of sight unseen. You're guessing when you go to the grocery store and you pick up that piece of meat what it's going to taste like. And you put on, you're guessing through a whole number of things, you know, color, marbling, brand. You might be looking at keywords. You might be thinking about animal welfare labeling, whatever, and you're trying to guess what you think your future eating experience is going to be like. There has been a ton of research on this sort of thing in the past. Facebook, Google, Amazon, they've all done this sort of research on how people think before. In fact, if you've ever been looking at Instagram or Facebook and it almost feels like it's reading your mind because things you were thinking about, you're now getting advertised about, this is how they started doing it. So a lot of tech groups have been doing this for years. Ag is dramatically behind on some of this. So that's why we funded this research in the first place, was to see how we can move ahead and see how people are thinking about the products. On top of that, anybody who's ever done surveys will tell you that how people answer in surveys and how they buy aren't necessarily the same. So they will say that things they care about are A, B, and C, and then when you look at buying data, they don't match up. And that can be very frustrating. So when you can look at this brain and eye information, you can get on how they actually feel rather than how they think they feel. How does the ag industry fit into all of this? Practically, how can you use this? So there were some usable pieces in what you just heard. Specific technologies led to the greatest change. So instead of sustainability as a main overriding topic, maybe get specific. Plastic. Can you talk about greenhouse gases? How can you get specific on what you're talking about? We all have issues that we're working on, and maybe that means that instead of one overriding infographic, you make 5. But if those are 5 infographics that people actually read and pay attention to, they'll be worth more than the one. These infographics stimulated thinking, the thinking part of the brain, and that's important. We need to get people thinking about these issues, and it's nice that they're engaging with them in that way. Riskier items had the more potential to change. And every one of us who's listening to this has areas that are seen as risky in your field. So what are those risky areas? Instead of being afraid of these, we should embrace them and think of that as areas where we have the greatest potential to change people's minds. Looking at some of these heat maps that Rhonda just showed you, you can see a big difference between the animal welfare heat map and the antibiotic use in animal heat map. There were parts of the antibiotic use infographic that people didn't seem to read at all. More research could really be done on why. Is it because of the design? Is it because of text versus pictures? Is it because of color? We don't know exactly why, and that didn't get teased out in this particular research, but would be really interesting to know. As you can see from that animal welfare infographic, people really read the whole thing. And so there's a lot of people think that the text doesn't get read on these, and that wasn't really shown in these heat maps. There must be more to it than that. So it would be really nice to get at why some of this, why the eye was drawn to some of this in the future. There were different strategies within the infographics, and since those weren't all tested individually, it's hard to know what exactly drove the reactions. I think that when you're making infographics, you can go back to the very beginning. What was the goal of the infographic? What are you trying to get people to learn about? How can you focus it a little bit more? And then I bring up this topic pretty frequently when I talk to people. We are always told that consumers are worried about science and that you can't get things too sciencey because they don't like it. You know, that Michael Pollan concept of you shouldn't be eating anything that your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize. That I wouldn't be eating a whole lot of things in that case, as my great-grandmother didn't recognize a whole lot of things. But I always point out that these new meat replacement products are really technology heavy, and they are not shying away from that. So if you look at the Impossible Burgers ingredient list on their website, they say what they are, and they don't shy away from methyl cellulose. They don't shy away from this extremely long ingredient list. They say why all those ingredients are in there. And I think that we could probably learn something from that as the ag industry. Is there a way that we could put ourselves more in the technology space than in the science space in some of these things? When you bought a new cell phone, did you go look up all the research studies and conspiracy theories about cell phone safety? I doubt it. So there probably is room for ag in talking about some of the things we do in a more technology focused way instead of a more science focused way. We all know that the science does not speak for itself. So I'm going to end this on just some questions. I want to challenge you. How can we as the ag industry be more proactive? How can we get more in front of consumers? How can we give them more of our information proactively? How do we combat resistance to change? It can be a big challenge when people start feeling like they're a member of a tribe. So if they buy all no GMO and they only feed organic food to their kids, it can be really challenging once they feel that way to get them to think about why they feel that way, because it's part of their identity, and that's important. It is important to think about the fact that people don't really usually want to change. They just want to feel better about what they think. So if we as an industry can make them feel better about the things they already think, we will probably move ahead. How can we follow up with consumers? If we get them thinking, how do we keep them thinking? A lot of times we drop these infographics and take off, but that doesn't really work. We need to keep engaging with them on a personal level. I think that if you look at the groups that are pushing a more vegetarian lifestyle, you'll see they engage with the people a lot, and they do continue to follow up. So how can we as an ag industry also follow up with people and engage more? How can we measure? If we're not measuring it, did it really happen? We need to be measuring a lot of this more actively and more proactively. And then people act differently in person than they do in surveys. But surveys are very often an indicator of what people feel is the right answer, what they think they should feel. It may not be what they are feeling at a moment in time, but it is very often what they think they should be feeling at a moment in time. And if they keep thinking that way for long enough, the feelings will become actions. So it's important to keep knowing the survey data at the same time. So I know that was really a quick overview. The main takeaway was that infographics work. Some of you who have bosses who might be a little hesitant about the infographics. I have had bosses like that in the past. This research shows that infographics are working, they are making people think. And that follow-up is absolutely vital, and we could really stand to be following up more. So with that, I will turn it back over to Hannah. If you want to get in touch with me, I am on Twitter at Jess Knows About, and I'm happy to respond to any emails or any phone calls. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. I'll go ahead and put all of your Twitter handles back up on the screen since you mentioned that. We do have some great questions already in the Q&A box, so we can go ahead and get started on those. We turn off the timer I started here now that everyone is good on time. So the first question we have here, most popular one in the box, I'm guessing this is for Rhonda. Jessica, you kind of addressed this as maybe an area for future research, but Rhonda, after doing the eye tracking analysis, did you change the content of the infographics and then try it again?
We did not, and that's a very good question. Some of the data that I didn't have time to present to you is that we wanted to give them the infographics, and we actually measured their attitudes prior to the infographics, and then showed them the infographics, did all that, and then asked them the same questions and about their attitudes after to see what things impacted that. And Jessica might address that as far as how they took that information and then what they could do with it. Because yes, there's obviously some really good information there. And I will just say one thing. I have to say one thing. The hormone, the implant, growth enhancing technology, infographic, a lot of people afterwards and talking to them, they said things like, I didn't know that. That was really interesting. And then that one seemed to have a lot of impact on people. They bring it up without any coaching, I guess.
Great. And Jessica kind of had the chance to address this in her wrap-up comments, but I want to let Rhonda and Tyler weigh in. So based on your research, what is kind of the one thing that animal agriculture can do differently when it comes to communication? So kind of what is the tactical action item or change in the way we do things based on your research? Tyler, I'll let you go first.
I think this research points to just a need to understand the communications and how they're relating to behavior and attitudes more, so that they can be crafted to, target particular ideas or to be more effective. Actually some of the most convincing data for me, even though, it's my turn to talk, I guess, it would actually be some of Rhonda's data on what people are looking at in those hormone infographics and the antibiotic infographics. We've actually looked a little bit at cutting those down afterwards based on these findings that they're really focused on those particular arguments. So they're missing, that means, some of the other ones. And I think knowing how people are approaching your infographics by looking at things like eye tracking, connecting that with whether they're viewing that more positively or negatively, associating that with risk as we're doing in functional neuroimaging, when you put the whole package together, really can help you design communications to be more effective for particular purposes. So do you want an infographic that just makes people largely feel positive about what you're doing in a particular area? That might suggest, putting not putting some of this more complex stuff on there. But when you do put complex things on there, like that that dose to response and sensitivity part at the top of the hormone infographic, when you do put it on there, you maybe want to cut out some of the other stuff too, because they're not focusing it on it anyway, and you really want to make them understand that more complex math part. So I think doing good consumer testing of these things is really what we're highlighting here, that the biometrics are uncovering things that people didn't necessarily anticipate when they made the original infographics.
I think that plays into one of the other questions we have here, which is how do maybe better infographics impact the call to action to consumers? So do they do something differently based on if an infographic is more effective based on the study? So is that, I think that's kind of what you were just getting at, that you have to think about what you want people to do before you even create the infographic, and then the kind of data you shared will help you do that more effectively. Is that a fair classification?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We use communications for a lot of different goals, and what exactly you're going to do with one, you can't do everything. As people are going to look at these for a limited amount of time. I don't know if maybe longer than the 30 seconds we use, probably not in many cases. So you've got about 30 seconds to work with people in terms of what they're going to do approaching the media and infographics that you give them. So what do you want them to do and come away with that from? In the study we ran, we did a little bit of post looking at the willingness to pay for organic versus non-organic, non-hormone versus hormone, stuff like that. And we saw some changes there based on the infographic. So these things do have longer term changes than just what they rate on the attitude scales. But we really need longer term studies then from this as well. So if we're going to turn around and say, how does this affect call to action? We need to get people after they've gone to the grocery store. We need to get people, after they've talked to their friends about this. One of the huge components we found that I didn't get time to talk about is the moralizing here and how it relates to people's norms. So if you ask people, like, do people like you approve of this technology, getting at that normative kind of thing, it's the biggest factor in predicting whether they're going to like something or not. So after people read this, that would suggest what we really want to know: do they go and talk to their friends and family about it? If they didn't say yes, that people like me like this, do they take that information about how there's actually more estrogen in a potato than in a steak? Do they take that to them and work with them to change their attitudes about it and change kind of the norms of the group? So those are things that we need to be measuring more long term. But this would suggest that tying biometrics into that deeper question of what they do way after they've seen these things is going to be critical to help to isolate those specific processing dimensions.
I think that answers another question that was in the Q&A box too, is, well, do we know if they actually understand what they read? Which it sounds like that was out of the scope of this study, but could be an area to look at in the future. Rhonda, how about your take on what's the action item for everyone listening based on your research?
Well, I think one of the things too, and kind of ties into what Tyler was talking about, is we actually took each of those infographics and defined them into areas or boxes. We call them, we might have had 3 main or 6 main boxes, depending on the infographic. And then we went through and were able to not only look at how much time they spent there, when they went away and came back, but then we were able to measure their emotions during each one of those times. And I have a huge dissertation, if anybody wants it, that talks about breaking each of those down. And that's really important information because it ties into what Tyler was talking about. I gave you the overview of their overall emotions, but how did they respond to that information? They spent most of the time at that, like on the hormone one, on the 1.9 nanograms. As a meat scientist, that makes me happy. That's the message we've been trying for 30 years to get out to people. But then we were able to look at whether that was a positive or a negative, or how they actually responded to that. And tying that into then what Tyler's doing, I think gives Merck and our industry a chance to figure out what are the positive buttons to push and which are the ones that we need to not be putting out there.
Great, thank you. Jessica, I want to give you kind of a chance to weigh in. Any final thoughts on action items or ways that our attendees can kind of make use of this information?
I think my number one point would be, how can we do more with this? How can we follow up? How can we get people thinking? How can we think outside the box? I know in my last job, I started taking some of our journal articles and turning those into infographics. And I can guarantee you that the infographics I made based on journal articles got read a whole lot more than the journal article itself ever got read. What are new ways of thinking that we can use to get to people, get them to read, get them to think, and just engage with them? Don't be afraid of engagement.
Awesome. Well, thank everyone so much. We are out of time. There's still questions in the Q&A box. So our speakers, I'm sure, would be more than happy to chat with you offline to answer those and talk more about these studies and future opportunities in more detail.